Welcome, and greetings to all. I am Shenlong Pendragon, the Lore Master. So, as always, a quick disclaimer. The following is a non-profit video. I do not own any of the images or the story in this video. The credit for these all belong to their original sources. So, ladies and gentlemen, today's story is the story of Sir Galahad and his quest for the Holy Grail. I did promise some more Arthurian legends were coming, and this is the next one in the series. I will obviously try to make this one a lot shorter than my King Arthur video I did a wee while ago. I know that was a bit too long, and I went on quite a lot of tangents. I promise I'll keep the tangents this time to an absolute minimum, and this is obviously going to be just a summary of the story. The actual story of Sir Galahad is far too long. It would take us it would probably take us several days to go through every little point, which obviously I'm not going to do. So this is just going to be a summarized version of the story. And ladies and gentlemen, I do hope you enjoy, and without further ado, let's move on. So, ladies and gentlemen, here we see the crest of Galahad, and those of you who will see it will obviously think, hey, it looks a little bit like the flag of England, the Cross of St. George. It's actually not meant to represent the Cross of St. George. It is in fact a reference to the Knights Templar and their vermilion cross on a white background. I'll go into why in just a few minutes. So Galahad's story is actually quite a late addition to the Arthurian legend, or saga if you will, and he actually doesn't feature, or at least his quest for the Grail doesn't feature in the original Grail stories written for the Arthur series, which I believe were originally composed by two French authors, or French writers at the time. I apologize for pronouncing this horribly wrong, but I believe it was Chrétien de Torres and Robert de Ban, who wrote those two Grail stories. Galahad's actual first appearance in the Arthurian series, or Arthurian saga if you wish, was in the 13th century by the French Arthurian epic known as Vulgate Cycle. His name itself likely is derived from the Welsh, and again, I'm going to pronounce this horribly wrong, I do apologise, Gwalchard, which roughly means the Falcon of Summer. So yes, I will reiterate on that point, as I did mention in the original, one of the original King Arthur videos I did. A lot of the actual stories originally come from French authors from the medieval period, and they're based on falsified stories of medieval England and Wales. So that is just an important point to make there, ladies and gentlemen. A lot of the origins of King Arthur are originally written by French, inspired by Welsh. And I did mention this previously, a lot of the stories are based very much on a Welsh poem. If you want to hear more about that, then please go look at the previous King Arthur video. So, as I promised, coming back to Galahad's crest here. So, as I mentioned, it's a reference to the Knights Templar rather than the flag of modern-day England. So, the whole point of this crest was to indicate that Galahad was seen as a holy warrior of the Catholic faith. It's actually worth pointing out that this particular crest, the vermilion cross on white background, was given to the Knights Templar by Pope Eugene III. The link to the Templars themselves in the story is likely due to Saint Bernard of, again I hope I pronounced this correctly, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who wrote about the Templars extensively, and his own monastic order, so he was a monk, as many of these authors and writers were actually attributed to writing or expanding upon the existing stories of Galahad as himself, which is why that crest would eventually become as what it is. But to go back now to the origins of Galahad's story truly, we need to first visit his parentage. So, ladies and gentlemen, some of you may recognise one of these names shown on this stained glass window, and, well, that is Elaine. Obviously, I'm hoping all of you recognise Lancelot's name. So, Elaine actually features in a anime and manga series known as the Seven Deadly Sins, where she is in fact a fairy and a sister of the current fairy king in that series. By all means, if you want to go have a look at that story or read the manga, watch the anime yourself, by all means feel free to do so. It's easily accessible on Netflix. So in that particular version of the story in the Seven Deadly Sins, Elaine is in fact the wife of Sir Ban, later episode King Ban, and they are in fact the mother and father of Lancelot. Now in the original series, or I say series, but in the original stories, Lancelot is indeed the son of Ban, but he is not obviously the son of Elaine. Lancelot is in fact a lover of Elaine, and I'll come into this in just a minute. Just a slight variation in the story that I find quite interesting. But yeah, moving swiftly on here. So Lancelot and Elaine were supposedly destined to have a son together, and this son was obviously Sir Galahad. Elaine herself actually is a princess of the kingdom of Corbenic, which is originally known as Helibial or Amite in the Vulgate cycle. Her father, King Pelles, was informed by some magical means, it's described, that Lancelot and his daughter would have this supposed glorified son chosen by God to recover the Grail. Now, some of you may be wondering, how can Arthur be king if this bloke Pelles is also king? Well, if you remember back to some of my other videos, the UK obviously at the time was not the UK, England was not England, Scotland wasn't Scotland, and Wales was not Wales. The whole place was broken up into multiple different kingdoms, with their own individual lords, kings, royal families, etc., etc. So King Arthur is the king of the Kingdom of Camelot, also known as the Kingdom of the Celts, or Kingdom of the Britons if you want, whereas this other bloke is obviously the king of the Kingdom of Corbenic. So, moving swiftly on, King Pelles is quite ecstatic. He's quite excited that his bloodline, his grandson, will be this holy warrior chosen by God. But there was a problem, and that problem was Lancelot. Lancelot was in love with Queen Guinevere, who, as we know, was King Arthur's wife, and the two of them were indeed having an affair. As a result, Lancelot was really not interested in pursuing any other woman at all. So, he designed a plan which relied heavily on the enchantress Dame Brucen. Now, much in very typical fashion to a lot of these stories, Dame Brucen decided that she would help by giving Pelles a ring that will allow Elaine to disguise herself as Guinevere long enough for their son to be conceived. It is indicated that Elaine herself did have some form of feelings for Lancelot, or at least found him unobjectionable. Otherwise, either she would have been very unkeen to go through with this plan, or it is possible that maybe she just saw it as her duty. But either way, as I say, it's implied that Elaine does have some kind of feelings for Lancelot. For lack of a better term, after the deed is done, Elaine actually reveals herself to Lancelot, and he flies into a berserk rage. He actually, in fact, draws his sword and threatens to strike her down for deceiving him, but thankfully, he doesn't, for Elaine is able to calm his rage when she informs him and tells him exactly why she did what she did. Lancelot will then go on to forgive Elaine, but he claims that he really doesn't want to have anything else to do with her or her father ever again, and leaves the kingdom of Corbenic and returns to Camelot to carry on his duties as a Knight of the Round Table. Now, as I pointed out, Lancelot did somewhat forgive Elaine for this deception, and this is actually an important point later, because Lancelot starts suffering from mental illness, and Elaine actually becomes a very important confidant and actually helps him through a lot of this mental illness, and they actually do in fact become good friends later. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that is the story of Lancelot's origins, if you will, and now we're going to come on to the man himself. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not really going to go into Galahad's younger years so much because they're not particularly relevant to the story as a whole. All I'm going to say is that Galahad did indeed grow up in the kingdom of Corbenic. He did know his mother Elaine, he did know his grandfather, I should say, Pelles, and he would grow to be trained in various knightly skills such as horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, etc., etc., etc. And throughout his entire life, his grandfather would constantly remind him that he is the supposed holy warrior that will find the Grail, and Galahad gets into his head because of this constant reminding that he is indeed the destined one, the chosen one to find the Grail. When he eventually reaches adulthood, he would meet his father Lancelot for the first time, and the two of them, in fact, have a duel. Now, you can argue for various reasons. I mean, different reiterations have different reasons for this duel. It could be that Galahad resented Lancelot for abandoning him. It could be that simply that Galahad knew that Lancelot was a warrior of renown and wanted to face him in single combat. In fact, it is even possible that Galahad didn't know that Lancelot was his father at the time. Now, in the Volgite cycle, it's mentioned that Lancelot is the supposed almost undefeatable warrior, and that he's never lost a duel in single combat when it was a fair fight. However, other reiterations of the story do claim that he did indeed lose to King Arthur when they first met, but again, that's a different reiteration of the story, and that's not the one we're focusing on. So in this particular version, Lancelot has never lost a duel in his life, yet he does lose to Galahad. Lancelot is so impressed by his son that he actually knights him on the spot, and then takes him with him to Camelot to introduce him to Arthur's court. So, ladies and gentlemen, while Lancelot introduces Galahad to the court, an old knight actually leads Galahad himself to the round table, where an empty seat is unveiled, waiting for this so-called prophesied holy warrior, the one who will find the Grail. Galahad takes the trials to see if he's worthy of being this one warrior, and manages to survive. Arthur is so impressed that Galahad has managed to survive and pass the trials that he in fact leads him to the final test himself, which is a magic sword which has been housed within a stone in a river. Yes, obviously this is all inspired by King Arthur's own story of the sword and the stone. Now, I know this is a slight tangent, ladies and gentlemen, but it is very, very important, and it is also my biggest pet hate in the Arthurian legends. The sword in the stone, not Galahad's one, but Arthur's one, is not Excalibur. I'll say it again because this is very, very important. The sword in the stone is not Excalibur. This sword, to use the Welsh name, is Caliburn. Or I say the Welsh name, but one of the Welsh names. The sword does have a few different names and reiterations depending on which version of the story you read. But as I say, this particular sword is Caliburn, not Excalibur. Excalibur was given to King Arthur by the Lady of the Lake, who's also known as Nemu. I won't go into the story as I did it in the previous video. Please, by all means, go have a look. So, Galahad's sword in the river actually has, again, its own inscription, much like Excalibur does. And this particular inscription, which is on the stone rather than the blade, reads, "Never shall man take me hence, but only he by whose side I ought to hang, and he shall be the best knight of the world." Having successfully retrieved the sword, Arthur invites Galahad to become a knight of the Round Table, declaring Galahad himself to be the greatest knight in the world. Galahad accepts and takes his rightful place. After they return to the court, sometime later, they are given a visitation or a vision of some kind, in which they see the Grail. Believing his time has come and it is his destiny, Galahad sets out on his grand quest to find the Grail. The rest of the Knights of the Round Table all follow at various different times, and Arthur has a bit of a sense of foreboding here, because he believes that this marks the beginning of the end of the Knights of the Round Table. And it's around this time that Mordred starts to make his ploy for power. Obviously the final battle doesn't take place yet, that takes place sometime down the road. I won't go into Mordred's story either, as I did that in the previous video. But anyway, moving swiftly on, I'm now going to cover Galahad's actual, or at least the summary of Galahad's actual quest for the Grail. So Galahad initially sets out on his travels alone, and obviously goes through various different side quests, if you will, helps out various people on his journey, defeats various opponents in combat, etc, etc. At one point even saving the life of his fellow Round Table Knight Sir Percival. He would eventually go on to reunite with Sir Percival and another Knight of the Round Table called Sir Bors, and they would set out on their journeys and travels together, as we see in this particular painting. The three knights together were known as the Three Blessed Virgin Knights, or sometimes the Grail Knights. At one point, with the help of Sir Percival's sister, they actually find the mystical ship of Solomon, which they need to cross the sea to find the sword of King David, which is one of the holy relics they need to find the Grail. The ship of Solomon is actually this ship here that we see in this particular painting. So, ladies and gentlemen, in a rather ironic twist of fate, Galahad's quest would take him full circle all the way back home. He, Bors and Percival would eventually arrive at Corbenic Castle, where the Grail has been housed all along. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, in an ironic twist of fate, the whole object of Galahad's quest, the very reason for his birth, was actually housed under his nose the entire time. It's just that nobody could actually get to the Grail within the castle until Galahad had gone on this great quest. The whole point of it was to prove that he was truly worthy of acquiring the Grail. While at Corbenic Castle, Galahad's actually given the opportunity to reunite with his grandfather, King Pelles, and his uncle, Prince Althazar. Sadly, he's not able to reunite with his mother, Princess Elaine, as she has sadly died by this point due to illness. Having finally acquired the Holy Grail, Galahad, Percival and Bors would take it to the holy island of Sarras, where it would be contained and housed forever, so that it could never be used for evil means. Having finally completed his quest at last, Galahad kneels down in prayer and makes the awesome decision to request that he be given the opportunity to die at a time of his own choosing, rather than to be snatched away by the jaws of fate and time. On the journey back to Camelot, the three knights are given another vision, or visitation if you will. This time they are visited by the spirit of Joseph of Amarantha. During this experience, Galahad is overcome by a glorious sense of rapture and wonder and more or less beguilement. Believing that there is no more beauty in this world for him to experience, and having done everything that he was supposed to do within his life, Galahad chooses that this is his moment, and decides to bow out of life with grace and respect. You may say that this is a rather sad ending to the tale, and I would agree, but at least, if nothing else, we can say that Galahad was able to go at least on his own terms. After saying goodbye to his two friends, Bors and Percival, the angels come down and take his immortal soul to heaven, leaving his mortal flesh on earth. Bors and Percival would eventually take Galahad's body back to the kingdom and bury him in the same grave as Percival's sister. Years later, Percival himself would later be buried here alongside his great friend and his sister. And thus, ladies and gentlemen, ends the legend of Sir Galahad, the world's greatest knight, and his quest for the Holy Grail. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. I do hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, then please remember to like and subscribe for more lore, myths, legends, and stories. I am Shenlong Pendragon, and until next time, knowledge is power.